Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for the next set that's scheduled to be dropping on Arena, which is the 30 card Alchemy set that ties into Tarkir Dragonstorm. And now this set is dropping tomorrow, I believe, which is really exciting. I didn't realise it was so soon, so really excited to get my hands on these and try them out. And unlike a lot of the recent Alchemy sets that I feel like there's been one or two standout cards, but most of them haven't been that great, I feel like this set in particular has some really good cards that are likely to really shape the Alchemy metagame, but also definitely have potential to see play in Historic. And there's a couple in here that I do think could maybe even sneak into Timeless as well. Obviously the bar is way higher for cards to clear there, but really excited to try these out. And I've also started to put together a bunch of Theorycraft deck lists built around these new cards already. And if you're an MTGA Zone Premium member, I put out an article yesterday breaking down the 4 Theorycraft deck lists in Historic and Alchemy that I'm most excited to try when the set drops. So if you're a Premium member, have a link to that down in the description. Definitely check it out. By the way, I'm going to be doing a set review or doing a review of all 30 cards here because, you know, unlike the main set, there's only 30 here. It feels worth going through all of them. And I'm going to start off by talking about what I think of them in Alchemy, and then move on to talking about whether I think they could potentially sneak into Historic or maybe even Timeless as well. But anyway, with that one out of the way, let's get straight into it. Starting off here with Hamza, Might of the Yathan. So straight away, I don't think this is going to be good enough for Historic or Timeless, really. In Alchemy, like, this is a powerful card, but this is a 5-drop that doesn't get you any value immediately, right? You need to have an additional land to get the landfall trigger. You would need to have mana to flip stuff up to immediately get the Endures bonus as well. So, I don't know, even in Alchemy, I'm not particularly impressed with this one. You know, you cast it on curve, it just gets killed by a removal spell, which is commonly played in Alchemy right now. So, I don't know, I'm not really sure about this one. It's also kind of weird because most of the Manifest Dread cards and, you know, the flipping face-up stuff in Alchemy is in Simic colours. And, you know, this is in Abzan, obviously, and the mana base just isn't good enough for 4 colours. So this is a really weird one where, you know, if this survives, it will likely take over the game, but it just doesn't have a good deck. It seems too expensive. It doesn't give you value immediately. So I'm personally not very high on this one. Then next up, we've got Lamb, Stormcrane Elder. So this is a really sweet card. I really like the design on this, but unfortunately, I just don't think it's going to be good enough to see play. So again, not good enough for Historic or Timeless, really. Even in Alchemy, again, this is a 4 mana card that doesn't give you value immediately. If you had ways of getting this into play for cheaper, you know, we've seen in the past with these sorts of effects, like Monastery Mentor itself, where you can discard it into the graveyard and then get it back for 1 mana with something like a Helping Hand or an Unearth, and then you've still got mana to trigger it immediately. Because this is 4 mana, you can't bring it back with any of those 1 mana reanimation spells because it's too expensive. In Historic and Timeless, there are a few cards that you can run to trigger this immediately. You've got the, you know, Mox Amber. You've got, you know, in Timeless, you've got Mishra's Bauble and stuff. But, you know, 4 mana is so expensive for Timeless. Same thing for Historic right now. So, I don't know. The card is really sweet, but I just don't see it seeing play. I just don't think there's a good enough way to get this into play and trigger it immediately, which I think is kind of a requirement for it to be playable. Then next up, we got Xho Cai, Flickering Talon. Not sure how to say this one, but when I saw this card, I was blown away. I had to keep rereading it just to make sure that I wasn't missing something. So at 2 mana, this card would be insane. However, I've been pointed out, or it's been pointed out to me on the MTGA Zone Discord. Shouts out to Ratkroger for cluing me up on this, that apparently they've come out on Discord and said that the mana cost they spoiled this out is incorrect. And that doesn't surprise me, because at 2 mana, getting a discount, getting to cast a 4-drop on turn 3 uninterrupted, even if the creature dies, getting Flurry, getting to blink itself, getting a Flying Vigilance Haste 2/3 for 2 mana is insane. So the fact that the mana cost isn't correct on this isn't a surprise to me. And also, if you look carefully, the background of the card is also the background used for 3 colour cards rather than 2 colour cards. So this should be 3 mana and it should be blue, red, white. Unfortunately, I was really excited for this card in Historic and maybe even Timeless. At 3 mana and 3 colours, I think that basically just kills it completely in the Eternal formats for me. You know, the difference in mana is just absolutely huge there. However, in Alchemy, I still think this is definitely a playable card, even at 3 mana, even at 3 colours. I'm just not sure what the best home for it is right now. Like, Jesco Control obviously would be the natural home, but, you know, in terms of control decks, most are either playing Bant for the ramp stuff and then, you know, Doppelgang and Ornate Imitations, or you go Grixis for the Chorus package. You know, most of the Grixis control lists are playing the Heist package as well. So I'm not sure this has a great home. I'm definitely still going to be trying it out in Alchemy, but I don't know. I'm still kind of reading from this card because until I found out that it was 3 mana, I just kept thinking I must be missing something with this card. It just seems so insane to me. So yeah, not 3 mana. Unfortunately, this was probably my most hype card of the set if it was 2 mana, but I also thought this has to be nerfed at some point. So I'm kind of glad that the mana cost was wrong on this. Bit unfortunate for Historic, but I still think this is going to be good in Alchemy. So next up we got Waystone's Guidance, which is a pretty interesting payoff for kind of the go wide decks. There are some good mobilized cards from the main set that have been seeing play in Alchemy. You know, Voice of Victory is definitely the main one. That's also been seeing some play, even in Historic in the Boros Energy Shell. But I mean, this particular card isn't good enough to see Historical Timeless play, in my opinion. Whether you would play this in Alchemy, I'm not really sure. You know, I look at a card like this and I always think, why would I not just play another threat instead of an enchantment? Obviously, the big advantage of it being an enchantment here is that it does survive board sweepers, it does survive creature removal, but I'm not sure if this card is actually very good at recovering from a board sweeper. Like, it does make your individual creatures slightly better when you do cast them, but I don't know, I just don't feel like the go wide mobilize convoke sort of decks are very good in Alchemy right now, in best of 3 anyway. Because there's so many board sweepers in the main deck right now, because of Bant Ramp, because of Grixis Heist and stuff, that I don't think those decks are that great. And even in those decks, I'm not sure this is that good. If this particular card was better at recovering from board sweepers, then maybe. But right now, I'm not that high on this card personally. Then next up, we got Thunderbond Vanguard, which is a really interesting card. So kind of a payoff for making a bunch of tokens, and we do have a lot of token generators in Alchemy. Again, I don't think this is a card that's likely to see play in Historical Timeless, unfortunately, but you know, we do see a lot of token decks. We've got Dollmaker, 3 Blind Mice, you've got Caretaker's Talent, you've obviously got Overlord of the Mistmoors as well. So there are a lot of tokens that just naturally see play in decks anyway. It's just whether those decks would want to play this card, and I don't think it's really worth it, to be honest. I feel like there are cheap, you know, better cards that are cheaper. Nactum and Shones, again, is still one of the best cards in the format, and this, while it does have some synergy there, you know, you don't really want to be playing 2 drops. You want to be playing... you don't really want to be playing 3 drops in those decks, particularly ones that don't have a massive impact on the game. And I also feel like this doesn't really shore up any of the weaknesses that those sorts of decks have, which is 2 board sweepers, namely. I mean, obviously, you know, Dollmaker, 3 Blind Mice plays around board sweepers, you know, quite effectively, but playing this kind of plays more into board sweepers, really. Now, admittedly, it does present a very fast clock when you are going wide, but like I said, I just feel like there are more efficient options in the sorts of decks that want to be playing this card, if that makes sense. Then next up, we got Ureni's Councel, which I really like the design on this card. It's really interesting that you can, you know, essentially change the mana cost on a card depending on how you build the deck. So you can build your deck in a way that is going to be able to cast this for 1 mana very consistently, and then you still have access to the Harmonized cost later, and I believe the Harmonized cost should still be discounted by the number of dragons in your deck. So if you do run a very dragon-heavy deck, you can potentially go cast this for 1 mana and then immediately Harmonize for 2 mana as well, which is pretty decent. Now, having said that, I don't think the dragons are particularly good in Alchemy. I haven't really seen any successful dragon decks, including cards from the main set. And because of that, I don't think the effect of Seeking a Dragon is particularly good, because those decks aren't that great. The dragons don't seem particularly powerful in Alchemy either. So personally, I'm not particularly high on this card, but I love the design of this sort of card where, you know, you can completely change how efficient a card is on rate depending on how you build the deck. So hopefully they make more cards like this in future with more playable tribes, I guess. The next we got Cunning Azurescale. So this kind of seems like an interesting tool for control. So you get a cantrip on the front side. Obviously, you know, getting a single card for 2 mana at instant speed isn't great, but you do get some card selection here, which is pretty big. You know, you can obviously find lands if you need, non-lands if you don't need, and then it does double up as kind of like a finisher later in the game. Once you hit 6 mana, you can flash it in. You got a 5/5 flying body that can, you know, most situations close the game out in 4 turns, and then it provides you some card advantage as well, which is pretty nice. So definitely not good enough to see play in Historical Time. This is just too slow, too inefficient there. In Alchemy, I could see this seeing play in a control deck. I like the fact that it does double up as a finisher and can be cast early for consistency as well. Now, having said that, I'm not sure it has a great immediate home is the big issue here, really, right? Most of the control or heavy, or I guess the top deck that mirrors control most closely right now is probably the Heist decks, which are Typically not running that many creatures because of my Celtic Ballad. So that's got the, the chorus package, the heist package. There's not really that much room left in the deck for a card like this. And a deck like Grixis Heist is already great at grinding into long games anyway. So I'm not really sure that you would run a card like this inefficient in the early game, but efficient in the late game where you're already good. So I'm not really sure it fits directly there. And then I'm not really sure there's much incentive to run. I guess with Xho Cai, you could look at running a Jeskai control deck. And without the heist package, you could probably fit in a card like this. So if you want to run a more conventional control deck, I could see this seeing play in Alchemy, but definitely not going to be good enough to see play elsewhere, I don't think. Then next up we got Pearl Lake Warden, which is quite an interesting card. Again, I don't think this one's likely to see play outside of Alchemy, but in Alchemy, this does seem pretty interesting to me, mainly because of the recent green cards we got that can discount creatures, right? You've got stuff like the Fountainport Charmer and, the name's eluded me. The other 2-drop ramp, it's like a mana dork that discounts the most expensive card in your hand every turn. But the interesting thing with that is that if you do discount this in your hand, I believe the sorcery side of this also gets discounted. So if, for example, you play a Fountainport Charmer and discount this card by 2, you can cast Nesting Instinct as like a ramp card for 1 mana, which is really powerful. And then, obviously, you can then cast this as a body as well. 4/5 flyer is going to be difficult for a lot of decks to get past, especially if they're reliant on red damage-based removal. So I think if you're running a ramp deck, this seems like a pretty interesting card that does play like a regular ramp spell on 3 if you need, but with these discounted cards you can use this to ramp even quicker, even faster, so definitely going to be trying it out in those sorts of shells. And then next up we've got Draconic Fealty, which basically is like an untargeted discard spell if you don't Behold the Dragon, but if you do Behold the Dragon, it then exiles the opponent's graveyard as well, which is pretty interesting. Now obviously non-targeted discard is way worse than targeted discard, although it does hit their most expensive cards, so you are more, it's better than something like Hopeless Nightmare, obviously. But where this is going to fit in is the issue for me. I don't think there's, obviously in Historic and Timeless, dragons don't see play anywhere really. And like I said earlier, in Alchemy, I don't think dragons are particularly good. I guess if you wanted to run a high density of discard spells, you could consider running this in without Beholding a Dragon as well. And then the Beholding a Dragon part seems quite situational as well. Maybe if you're running a dragon deck, this is more of a sideboard card, but again, I don't think we're really getting enough good dragon support for dragons to break through in the current Alchemy metagame, so this feels like an interesting card that's going to be at the back of my mind going forwards, but right now I just don't really see a good home for it anywhere, to be honest. Then next up we got Sibsig's Artisan, which seems like quite an interesting kind of grindy tool. So 2 mana for a 3/2, pretty aggressive stats in Alchemy anyway. Again, I don't think this card is going to be good enough for Historical Timeless. We'll get to those cards eventually, trust me. But this one, I don't know, it seems like an interesting tool in grindy games, right? The whole idea with this is, you probably attack with it early, maybe it gets killed, maybe it gets blocked, goes to the graveyard, then you can activate the Renew ability to buff another creature, and then that creature also gets the Renew ability, so when that dies, you can keep doing it to the next one. So basically, it's like a repeatable buff that you can keep putting on your creatures if they keep dying, which is interesting, but again, it doesn't seem that good compared to what the format's already doing. I don't feel like I guess, I was going to say I don't think that there's a deck that could effectively use this, but we've seen Insidious Roots decks in the past be good. I believe we've still got most of the cards from those decks, and we're also getting another support card in this Alchemy set that works very well alongside Insidious Roots, so you can maybe run this as a card that you can pair with Roots that's kind of decent on curve, provides a buff if you mill it over, because obviously Roots decks you want to be self-milling quite a lot, kind of pairs well with Overlord of the Belmurk perhaps. So if Insidious Roots comes back, this is maybe a card that you could look at. But again, 3 mana is quite expensive from the graveyard, but it does exile itself, so it does trigger your Roots. So I think if this does see play, it's probably going to be in some sort of Insidious Roots deck. And I'm not really sure, if you've got other ideas. I was thinking about, could you potentially combo with this card somehow, but the fact that you would repeatedly need 3 mana is the real breaking point for that. So maybe Insidious Roots, but outside of that, I'm not really sure where this sees play. The next time we got Runeblade Raiser, which we've seen this sort of effect quite often. these sorts of one-drop creatures, they're often statted 2/1 that can repeatedly bring themselves back from the graveyard, except this one isn't repeated. You do it once and then it loses the ability, so it seems just worse than a lot of the other cards we've had in the past that do this sort of thing. So Eternal format's not really good enough. Even in Alchemy, I don't think this really has a great home. So unless I'm missing something, unless there's some combo that I'm not aware of with this card, which seems unlikely considering it perpetually loses the ability, I don't know. I just don't really see this one fitting anywhere personally. Then next up we got Swiftspear's Teachings, and now we're hitting the bangers. So this card is going to be huge in Alchemy. I think it's going to be a big part in Historic, and I do think it could potentially see play in Timeless as well. I think it's that good. So I'm going to start off here by talking about Historic, because we haven't talked about that so far. None of the cards so far have really been good enough to see play there, but this card, I'm so confident this is going to see play in Historic, purely because it's just a straight upgrade in a deck that is already pretty good in Is It Wizards. Now, Is It Wizards obviously was the best deck in the format for quite a while, has fallen off relative to the rest of the format recently. Got one or two bad matchups against a number of the top decks, but I do think this card is just a big upgrade in that deck on Reckless Charge. Now, Reckless Charge has obviously been a key part of the fastest builds of Is It Wizards, which I think if you're playing Wizards, you need to be on the fastest builds right now, just because of the speed of the format. But this card just seems so much better than Reckless Charge for a number of reasons. So first of all, it makes interaction way less bad because it draws you a card. So the big issue with Reckless Charge was that if your opponent had instant speed removal up and you went creature Reckless Charge and they killed it in response, that's a real blowout. You're down, 2 cards to their 1 essentially at that point. Whereas Swiftspear's Teachings draws you a card. So if you go Teachings on 1 into Arcanist or Symmetry Sage on 2, and the opponent does have it instant speed removal so they can kill it before the creature gets to attack, you're still card neutral in that exchange. You've still drawn a card off this, so it doesn't really matter as much if the opponent has instant speed removal. One of the biggest reasons why I didn't like running Reckless Charge in particular builds was exactly that reason. So replacing Reckless Charge with Teachings basically just single-handedly makes the deck a good amount less vulnerable to creature removal, which is huge because that's one of the biggest weaknesses of Is It Wizards. Secondly, it pairs so well with Dreadhorde Arcanist, because if you cast this on turn 1, draw a card, then you can play Arcanist on turn 2. It gets haste, which means it can attack immediately, and then flash back the Swiftspear's Teachings, which then draws you another card and gives you haste and prowess on your next creature. It permanently gives the Arcanist prowess, which means that it can buff its own power to then recast more expensive spells, which is huge with the Chorus package, because then it allows you to recast Hymn to the Ages more consistently. Also allows you to cast Flame of Annor more consistently, which is absolutely huge as well. And then the fact that you invest the mana up front on this means that you'll also have more mana available on the turns where you cast the creature that gets haste. So for example, I think a fairly common curve out once this card is in the deck is Teachings on turn 1 into Symmetry Sage and another 1 mana instant or sorcery on turn 2, which then not only gives you Symmetry Sage prowess in addition to the other buff that it gives, but it also means that the Sage is less vulnerable, right? Typically in the past, if you had Reckless Charge over Teachings, you would run out the Symmetry Sage on turn 1, which gives the opponent more information, makes sorcery speed interaction live, means they're more likely to be holding up in open instant speed removal as well. So, being able to invest your mana up front on this seems huge. It also seems really nice if you're running the Chorus package, because if you have this boon available and then you start drawing a bunch of cards off the Hymn to the Ages, you can then have these crazy bursty turns where you get a bunch of hastes into play that also get prowess. Now, we do have a number of creatures we have a couple of creatures in Is It Wizards that already have prowess and haste, but prowess can stack as a trigger. So even if you give the buff to Soulscar Mage, that Soulscar Mage would have 2 instances of prowess, so you don't lose out on that anyway. And then you've also got Slickshot Show Off that obviously has haste itself as well. So you would lose out on the haste if you cast that with the boon, but giving Slickshot Show Off prowess does mean that it can deal even more burst damage, and you can obviously plot it as well so that you can just have it hanging out in exile. Try and find another creature if you want to give that haste and prowess instead, and then you can still obviously cast the Slickshot Show Off afterwards as well. So this card just seems insane in Is It Wizards, and then that's just a deck that already happens to exist. I'm sure there's so many other decks that could utilize this as well. I was very excited to try out Arcanist and Fear of Missing Out with Arena of Glory alongside Thoughtseize and stuff, but that doesn't really work out in Historic because you need exactly Blood Crypt into Arena of Glory to be able to do that curve, which is really difficult to do without fetch lands. Now, with Swiftspear's Teachings in place of Arena of Glory, you can pretty consistently go Teachings on 1, Arcanist on 2, or, Teachings on 1, get Delirium online, cast a Fear of Missing Out, get an extra trigger. And that's just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's so many cards in Historic that could really benefit from this, and it feels like the floor is pretty low on this card, and the ceiling just seems really big as well. Alchemy, this card is going to be huge as well. There's a number of aggro decks that could really take advantage of this. There's the Mice deck, the Otters deck. Both of those very powerful, and this seems like a great addition there as well. Seems great alongside the Chorus package in those decks if you're running it as well. And then in Timeless, again, I'm not 100% sure about this one in Timeless, but it seems powerful enough. Arena of Glory sees play in Timeless alongside Flades. This seems like a very similar effect. Again, works very nicely with cards like Arcanist. So, again, I'm not 100% sure about this one in Timeless, but I wouldn't be surprised if it sees play there. But outside of that, I would be shocked if this one doesn't see play in Historic or Alchemy, or both, really. So next up we've got Dragonblood Twins. So again, I don't think this one's going to be efficient or good enough to see play in Historic or Timeless, but in Alchemy, this is pretty interesting, right? It's a 2-mana 2/2 that can turn into a 4/4 once you cast your second spell each turn and produces another one of itself, so it's pretty efficient on rate. I think the issue is just that it doesn't have a great home right now, but we do have a decent number of flurry payoffs in the deck. Now maybe with Xho Cai, you could maybe look at running this in like a Jeskai deck. And then you could run even more of the Chorus package. You could run the white Chorus card that brings creatures back from the graveyard, which is nice to discount with the Xho Cai. And, you could run Stock Up and stuff as well that are good to discount alongside it. So, again, I wouldn't be shocked if this doesn't see play purely because there's not a good home for it. But it does seem decent on rate. If there is a deck that wants to be triggering Flurry or is good at triggering Flurry very consistently, then I could see this one seeing play. But very surprised if this one sees play outside of Alchemy. Then next up we got Dragonsoul Prodigy. Again, not going to be good enough for Timeless and Historic, but Alchemy, this is kind of interesting. So Omen spells, if you're not familiar, are basically the instant or sorcery side of the adventure cards that we got in the main set. So for example, Twin Moors Stormbrood here, the sorcery side is the Omen. So presumably the way this works is you get this in play, you cast an Omen spell, and then you get a copy of the creature which has haste and can attack. So you cast your Dragonsoul Prodigy, you cast the Charring Bite, killing a creature, and then you get a 5/4 flyer that gains 5 life. And that is a pretty powerful effect, but again, this is a 3-mana card that doesn't provide any benefits straight away. You'd have to build around it by running a bunch of the adventure cards, which there are a few that are like okay on rate, but I just don't think it's really worth building around right now. So I would be quite surprised if this sees play in a top deck, even in Alchemy. Then next we got Stormforged Armor, and I really like the design on this card, and I do think this is pretty powerful. This could maybe see play in Historic, potentially. Like, I'm excited to try this out alongside Stoneforge in an aggressive shell. Again, that I would be surprised if that's good, but it seems worth trying out at the very least. So this is a 3-mana equipment. Very importantly, doesn't cost mana to equip, which is huge. So you can play this on turn 3 and equip immediately, and then when the creature attacks, you conjure a Ball Lightning on the field. So if you're not familiar with what that card is, it's a 6/1 with trample and haste that you sack at the beginning of the next end step. So that's a lot of pressure. You get a 6, representing 6 extra damage every single attack step, and it does seem to curve out fairly well in an aggressive shell, right? All you need to do is just cast a 2-drop on turn 2, or have a 1-drop in play, cast this, equip it, and then attack. You don't even need to connect to get the Ball Lightning. Now, having said that, it doesn't provide any buffs, so that means, if you've got a smaller creature, you're just going to be losing that in combat likely, but this seems great if you're playing an aggressive shell, right? It gives you a bunch of extra reach. The fact that you can re-equip it for free is huge as well. Makes it really difficult for the opponent to deal with, because then they have to hold open instant speed removal to kill whatever creature you've equipped with it. And then because this is an attack trigger, I guess they have the opportunity to kill it between the main phase and the declare attacker step, which doesn't give you an opportunity to re-equip it. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. So that is, that's the main point the opponent has to interact with you. But I don't know. I think this card is going to be good in Alchemy. I could see it slotting into Boros Mice and is it Otters? I'm not sure if you'd run it in the main deck, but maybe against a deck that's very interactive, you could run this as just a way to kind of circumvent as much creature removal, repeated extra pressure, and then, like I said, in Historic, Stoneforge on 2, into this on 3. Again, I'm not convinced that's good, but there's something there that I want to try out at the very least. So I think this is probably good enough to see play in Alchemy and maybe at a stretch in Historic, but not super optimistic there. We'll see. So next up we got Dragon Typhoon, and this is another one of my favourite designs from this set. Obviously kind of a throwback to Shark Typhoon. So this one, 6 mana as well, and then similar sort of thing. Whenever you cast a dragon or a non-creature spell, you draft a card from the spellbook onto the battlefield, which I believe the spellbook is Thunderbreak Regent, Stormscale Scion, Magmatic Xho Cai, Boltwing Marauder, Nerif Heart of the Storm, Caldera Pyramore, and Thundermane Dragon. So some pretty powerful cards in here. Generally more powerful than Shark Typhoon, especially if you're casting cheap spells, because of the size of the dragon, or the size of the creature you get doesn't depend on the mana value like it does with Shark Typhoon. The downside of it compared to Shark Typhoon, though, is that the channel ability is more steep, right? The channel ability, you can put this to the graveyard for 4 mana and get a 4/4 red dragon creature token, which is interesting. It's also a Kindred enchantment, which is one of the first ones that we've seen on Arena, I believe, which is interesting for Delirium, potentially. Maybe, again, I don't think this is a game-winning spell off something like Shifting Woodland, but, maybe there's something there. Also discards itself. It's also notably a dragon as well, so you can potentially behold this, which could be relevant for a few cards, obviously, for the main set that we've seen. In Alchemy, I wouldn't be surprised if this is playable in a control shell. This can be channeled on turn 4 if you need to just get a body on the battlefield, and then if you do get to 6 mana, casting this does just win you the game, basically. But again, I don't know. I feel like we already have better payoffs in control decks, maybe, so I wouldn't be shocked if this sees no play. But again, I don't know. Like, Shark Typhoon has been good enough to see play in Eternal formats for quite a while now. Obviously, the less flexibility on the channel side is the big issue here, because most of the time with Shark Typhoon you are just going to be cycling it in the early game, whereas this, I think you're running to hardcast it, and I don't think it's really good enough to. Maybe you could run this in addition to Omniscience as an enchantment to bring back from the graveyard that kind of wins you the game. Obviously we had Draco Genesis in the main set, but that then requires running dragons to actually win the game. Whereas this card, you can just run this in a deck with non-creature spells and it'll be good enough on its own. So I could see this seeing play as top end in a control deck in Alchemy maybe, but outside of that, it just seems too expensive elsewhere, I think. But I love the design of it. It's such a cool card. So next up we got Pampered Loamfrill, which I'm really excited about. I think this card is going to be good in Alchemy and could even potentially see play at some point in Historic as well. So in Alchemy, I'm definitely excited for this card, specifically in Insidious Roots alongside Chitinous Crawler. So Insidious Roots is a deck that I did quite a lot of work on a while back before rotation, and I believe the deck should still be viable. And this card seems like it could be a really effective part of that deck, because Insidious Roots decks typically want creatures that you can just cast on curve and be fine with. This fits that bill, right? 1 mana, 1/1 with Death Touch makes it really difficult to attack past. If it does go to the graveyard because the opponent kills it or you block with it, you then have it in the graveyard to use the Renew ability. But the thing that's really nice about this is that it's really good alongside Self-Mill. And I think, in those sorts of Insidious Roots decks, you obviously want Self-Mill, stuff like Overlord of the Baelmerk, and I forget the name of the 2 mana enchantment that mills stuff over and gains you life whenever you exile stuff from the graveyard. But, those sorts of cards are what you want to be running in Insidious Roots decks alongside Chitinous Crawler as well. This seems like a card that is very, very good in the Insidious Roots deck. It's kind of like your main finisher as well. And Pampered Loamfrill seems great because if you mill over both of them, or, the opponent kills the crawler or whatever, you can use this to conjure a copy of your big finisher on top of the deck, draw it the next turn, and then kind of just go crazy after that. So I think this card is going to be a slam dunk in those sorts of decks for sure. And then, there's a few other graveyard decks I've been working on as well that I could potentially see this slotting into when you need to find particular cards as well. And that's the main reason why I also think it could see play at some point in Historic as well, because over the years I've wanted an effect like this. It's kind of reminiscent of Unburial Rites in a way, where you could run a deck that's just a ton of self-mill, and then you have a creature win condition. You can just, if you mill over Loamfrill and your win condition, you can just use the Renew ability from your graveyard to get a copy of your win condition on top of the deck, draw it, and then kind of just win the following turn. Now, 2 issues with that. These sorts of incredibly focused self-mill decks typically aren't very good in best of 3 because of graveyard hate. So if this is a deck at some point, likely to only be best of 1, but that's alright, some decks are like that. The other issue though is that I just don't think there's a good enough payoff right now. For this to be good, you would need to have, I think a 2 or 3 mana creature in Historic, like a finisher that can kind of combo off if you have a bunch of stuff in your graveyard, which nothing's coming straight to mind, but having an effect like this that can conjure your win condition to the top of the library does seem appealing in some decks that I've been trying to build in the past. So again, I don't think this has a great home in Historic right now, but if in future there's a self-mill combo deck that has a 2 or 3 mana creature that can kind of combo off, this seems like a really good way to find it more consistently. And then again, like I said, definitely going to see play in Alchemy and Insidious Roots, or I'm definitely going to be trying out anyway. So next up we got Hardened Bonds, and this card is insane. This is another one that I think could see play in Alchemy, Historic, and potentially Timeless as well. So this is basically a 1 mana enchantment that if you have some number of +1/+1 counter synergies to get this going, it basically reads draw a buffed creature every single turn, which is insane for 1 mana. And it's Seek as well, it's not even draw, so it doesn't trigger Orcish Bowmasters if we are playing Timeless as well. Speaking of which, the quote-unquote downside of this card, or the build around, I guess is probably a better word, is that you need some kind of +1/+1 counter synergies to get this going. But the nice thing is that I think there are some just generically powerful ones that can do that anyway. Obviously, in Timeless you got Bowmasters, in Historic you got Marionette Apprentice that can put a counter on itself. That there are a number of playable cards that can enable this. Obviously, the most natural home if we're looking at Historic is probably Hardened Scales. That whole deck is built around +1/+1 counter synergies. Now, Hardened Scales has never really been top tier in Historic. It's a deck that I've tried a lot of the times over the years, and it has felt close. But recently, we have got a number of really good support cards for Hardened Scales. We recently got Market Back Walker and Hangerback Assembler, which have both been really impressive to me. So I'm definitely going to be trying out Hardened Scales again when this set drops, because I feel like Hardened Bonds is maybe the best card in the set, and Hardened Scales is the deck that can use it the best, especially if you're running Hardened Bonds and Luris. It feels like that's just good enough grind ability in the mid to late game that you can probably just focus the rest of the deck on proactive, trying to be as quick as possible, which feels really important in Historic right now. So but yeah, that's one potential home for it. Another really nice thing about this card is that it also potentially enables combos with creatures that have Persist. Putrid Goblin is a combo that I've tried a lot over the years, and if you find Putrid Goblin off this and it gets that perpetual ability, that's a way that you can potentially enable the Persist loops on its own. So that's another home I'm really excited to try out. Again, it's going to be difficult to have enough +1/+1 counter synergies to get this going in that sort of shell. It's definitely a deck I'm going to have to think about, but that's another potential home for it. It just seems like this card is so generically powerful that it's worth building around, and there are probably enough generically good cards that put counters on stuff anyway to get this going. And then the really big thing about this going forwards is that as future sets get added, there will just be more and more generically powerful cards they print that have counter synergies that then make this kind of even more free to splash in more decks, if that makes sense. So I'm so excited for this card. It seems really, really pushed. So next up we got Amber Plate Ainok, which not a particularly exciting card to me. Double Team is nice on this, and then it can either buff itself or produce tokens if you can tap it or attack with it and it's 5s, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem particularly powerful to me, especially compared to some of the other cards we've seen so far. The next one we got Betor's Edict, which is kind of similar to Maelstrom Pulse. 3 mana sorcery speed, flexible removal. Does provide some additional benefits if you're running it in a dragon deck, but again, I haven't been convinced on the dragon deck as a whole in Alchemy. So I think if you're going to be running this, it's probably just going to be for the flexible removal for 3 mana sorcery, which I think is okay for Alchemy. If you feel like your creature removal isn't quite cutting it and you need to be able to remove other stuff, which does happen quite a lot, to be honest. A lot of people are running Exorcise right now because of its flexibility, although this being sorcery speed as opposed to instant speed is a bit awkward, especially alongside Dollmaker, right? I think one of the main reasons that Exorcise is really nice is because you can cast it in response to Dollmaker, so they don't get to blink their overlords and stuff. So I think maybe being a sorcery speed might be the thing that probably forces us to not see play, but I don't know. If you're running a Golgari-based mid-range deck, I wouldn't be shocked to see this one seeing play, but not a massive card really. Then next up we got Illuminating Lash, and this is another card that I'm incredibly excited about. I think this card is going to be huge in Alchemy, and also potentially see play in Historic as well. Maybe Timeless, probably too slow there, but I could definitely see this one breaking through in Historic. So this is basically a sorcery speed lightning strike that draws you a card, which is insane for 2 mana. That seems so good to me. Obviously, sorcery speed is a big downside, especially in Historic, where, you know, being able to kill creatures from the Auras deck at instant speed is really big as well. But, you know, getting this sort of effect, the fact that 3 damage can go anywhere, means you could potentially slot this into like a burn shell, and then burn running out of gas is the main issue for those sorts of decks. So getting the extra spell is good. You know, you're guaranteed to draw off this. Basically, you know, every deck that runs this is going to be running a bunch of other non-creatures, so this just seems like a slam dunk. This is going to be running basically every blue-red deck in Alchemy, I would assume, which is going to be a bit of a nightmare, I think, because, you know, blue-red is already one of the best color combinations because of the chorus package. So, you know, this card is probably going to be a headache in Alchemy. I imagine it's going to see play everywhere there. In Historic, obviously, you know, the homes that this can fit in is a lot smaller. Izzet decks are a thing. You've obviously got you got Wizards, you got Jeskai Control, you've got Phoenix as well, you know, still on the fringes. But I don't know if this card really breaks through in Wizards or Phoenix, really, because instant speed damage is really important right now, and that deck doesn't really struggle to grind into longer games either. Neither does Phoenix. So maybe, I don't know, it seems on power level that this should be good enough for Historic. Maybe it doesn't have a great home right now, but yeah, I expect this card to be everywhere alongside the chorus package in Alchemy. Very, very good card. So then next up we got Dalkovan Outrider, which is kind of a weird card to me. I think this is, you know, just on the face of it, good enough to see play in Alchemy. It's just too slow and clunky for Historical Timeless. But in Alchemy, you know, Mobilize is a strong keyword. You get decent stats for a 3-mana creature, and then it does enable itself as well, right? Because if the mobilized creatures don't get blocked during combat, they sacrifice themselves during the end step, which then triggers the passive ability on it, starts buffing the creatures on top of your library, which you can then draw the following turn. So, you know, it's a self-contained engine that does seem pretty good on rate, so I wouldn't be shocked if this sees play in Alchemy. I think the issue with it for me, though, is that if you want to lean more heavily into it and build around Mobilize, most of the other good Mobilize cards are in white. You can still run Mardu, but I don't know. It just feels like it's good on rate, but it just feels like compared to what the rest of the format is doing, this kind of effect is a little bit too small. You know, it feels like most other decks can go over the top of this fairly easily. I guess the most natural home would probably be in an aggro deck, but I don't know. I can't see running this over Otters. I can't see running this over Mouse, like the Mice deck. So it wouldn't surprise me if this is a card that seems reasonable on rate, but just doesn't have a good home, if that makes sense. Then next up, we got Song of Seasons, which is a pretty interesting card. So on its face, this feels very similar to Cultivate, right? You get 3 lands, 1 on the battlefield, 1 in your hand, 1 in the graveyard. Now, Cultivate's, you know, playable card in Alchemy, I think, and ramp is a big part of the format right now. I think the big issue with this card, though, is that most of the ramp decks are leaning towards Bants, and I'm not sure this is a good enough reason to move back into red, really. I mean, I guess the main reasons to run Temur in the past were so that you could run win conditions with Doppelgang, right? You could run the Roxanne, which gives you the token you can copy, as well as Overlord of the Boiler Bridges. I always forget how to say that one. But I don't know, with Ornate Imitations and Board Sweepers and Overlord of the Mistmoors, I'm not really sure that's a good enough reason to want to move away from Bant right now. So playing this fairly, I'm not really sure it's going to be good enough even at Alchemy. But the thing I keep looking at with this card is, can you combo with it? Is there something that you can use with this? But I don't know. I think the only way that you could do that was if you ran one specific non-mountain, non-forest land that you want to be able to find very consistently. Now, importantly, you can also run Stomping Ground in addition to mountains and forests, and then, you know, find whatever extra land it is you want. But for 3 mana, that seems very slow. I think if you wanted to find a specific land, you should just be running Traverse Valley instead, which is still legal in Alchemy right now, I believe. I guess I'm more thinking about Historic right now with that sort of thing. You know, maybe you're running a Lotus Field deck, or Ugin's Labyrinth is a card, you know, Traverse Valley and Nugan's Labyrinth is kind of like a package I've been trying a lot in Historic in a few different shells. But the difference between 1 and 3 mana there is huge. I also can't think of a way that you could utilise putting the land in the graveyard, really. So this is definitely one of the cards that, if you have a good idea for it, I'd love to hear it. Because I keep looking at this card and thinking, there could be something here, but I'm just not sure what I'm missing, really. So if you're using this card fairly, I think it's good on rate, but not really worth moving into red in the ramp decks in Alchemy. And then if we can figure out a combo with this, maybe it has a chance in Historic. But again, wouldn't shock me if this card sees no play anywhere, really. Then next up we got Call the Crash. Again, another really cool design here. So conjure 2 Seed Rhinos on the battlefield. Hardcast it for 6 mana or suspend it for 4 so that you get it, going into your turn 6 if you cast it on curve anyway. And I don't know. I think if this card sees play, it's probably in some sort of ramp shell. You really want to be casting this ahead of curve, but it feels like if you're ramping, you're much better off just going Ornate Imitations or Doppelgang right now. So, unless I'm missing some other synergy, if there's some way that I'm forgetting about in Alchemy where you can, some sort of Mizzix Mastery style effect where you can get this in the graveyard and then cast it for cheaper, but I don't know. I like the design on it, but it feels like the ramp decks are already going way over the top of what this is doing, so I'm just not sure this has a great home right now. If you've got a good idea for this one, this is another one where I'd love to hear it, though, because I'd love to play this card in a competitive deck, but I just don't think there's a good home for it right now. Then next up we got Stonehide Ancient, and this one actually seems pretty interesting to me. So it's very good at enabling itself, right? If you cast the Omen on turn 3, 2 damage to any target, and then it reduces the cost of itself, basically, to what would that be, 4 mana, and then casting this on turn 4 as kind of like, it's not really a board sweeper, but against most decks this is just returning everything back to their hand, and you get a 6/6 flying vigilance. I don't know, this card seems pretty good to me. Even if, and I think the important thing about this card is that it just enables itself. You don't need to do any work for this card to be good. Obviously, if you want to cast it on turn 4, you need to lead on turn 3 with the Warning Tremor, which you might not always want to do. But, so many decks in Alchemy right now are going wide, swarming the board, that this just seems like a really effective way to reset that. Also, Temur does, as I mentioned before, Temur ramp is an option. I don't think the previous ramp card we saw was a good enough reason to move into Temur, but I don't know, this card could be a decent, it basically works as like a 4 mana board sweeper that also gets a big creature on the board. That seems pretty good to me. Now again, I think other ramp decks might go over the top of you potentially, right? If you're running this over Doppelgang Ornate Imitations, then the mirror is going to be a little bit trickier, but you could run this alongside it, I think, and I don't know, this card just seems really good on its own, so I expect this to see play in Alchemy for sure. Just not sure what the best shell for it is yet. Then next up we got Mardu Thunderkite, which seems like a really push card in terms of what it does on rate. So 3 mana, obviously, needing red, white, black is not free, right? Especially in Alchemy where the mana base still isn't that great for 3-color decks. So, you are going to have to do some work in your mana base to be able to cast this on turn 3. But if you can consistently cast this on turn 3, it seems really good to me in Alchemy. It has flying, mobilize 2, and it gives creatures of your choice Menace, Lifelink, or Haste, which are all really useful abilities. So you can, at worst, baseline, just give this Haste as it enters, and then, you can just attack in, get the mobilize 2 triggers, potentially get in for 4 damage straight away if the opponent doesn't have any blockers. Mobilize enables the other synergies as well. So with Mardu Thunderkite, I think I'm actually more excited now for the Dalkovan Outrider. I could see these as the 3 drops. You run Voice of Victory, you run some other payoffs for Mobilize. It seems like a pretty decent aggressive shell. You're also in good colours for interaction as well. Obviously not in blue for Hymn to the Ages, which is always a downside, but I guess they're kind of playing at either ends of the spectrum, right? Hymn to the Ages decks want to be grinding into the longer game. This sort of deck just seems to want to close the game out very quickly. Now again, I think the big issue with that sort of deck right now is board sweepers. The Bant deck seems full of them right now, so you would need to get some counterplay, but you are playing black. You do have access to discard spells potentially, so this is definitely a shell I'm going to try out. And Mardu Thunderkite seems, decent on rate. In terms of older formats, definitely too slow for Timeless, and it just feels too slow for Historic as well. I was thinking maybe there's some sort of shell that would want this. Mobilize creatures alongside Goblin Bombardment has been pretty effective recently, but you have to ditch Luris for this. I'm not really sure that's worth it, to be honest. The next up, we got Audacious Knuckleblade. So this is kind of another support card for the activated abilities kind of thing that we've seen going on recently. And one deck that I'm very excited for, that I've got in my premium article down below, is a combo deck that I've been working on where you use Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Sleep Cursed Fairy, and Redshift. And basically the way it works is if you can set up a creature that has both of those abilities, Sleep Cursed Fairy and Redshift, and you can reduce the cost of the untap ability or make the creature big enough that it produces more mana than the untap ability, you can basically just get infinite mana there. If you have Trackhand Trainer as ability, you can then draw your whole deck, and then once you've drawn your whole deck, you can just use Redshift's ability to put your whole hand into play and just win from there. Even if you don't have the Trackhand Trainer ability, you can still use the Exhaust ability to put your whole hand into play. So it's a very powerful combo, and the really nice thing about it is that all of the individual cards are decent on their own and work quite well together as well. You've got Trackhand Trainer, which is just really good on its own anyway, but also works very well with other activated ability cards as well, which you are running in this deck. You got Redshift, which can pump mana into other activated abilities as well. So running those sorts of cards alongside somewhat of a plan B, so you're not just super reliant on Agatha's Soul Cauldron, actually seems like a pretty good deck to me. The issue, though, was that there just wasn't really another good creature that had good activated abilities. I think there's the 5-mana Temur Loot. I can't remember the full name of the card, which does have very good activated abilities, is great with Soul Cauldron if you can get it in the graveyard early, but being 5 mana is so steep. So the big issue with that deck is that I just couldn't find another cheap enough card that has good enough activated abilities where you can still win the game with, your plan B alongside Trackhand Trainer that can reduce its costs, or your plan B alongside Redshift that can pump mana into it, and then you're not really reliant on Soul Cauldron, because that was the big issue with the deck. If you build really heavily around the combo, you're very vulnerable to both graveyard hate and artifact removal as well. So Audacious Knuckleblade, basically the roundabout way I'm trying to say it is, this card just seems like the card that deck has been missing, right? It's 3 mana as opposed to 5. All of the abilities on this are great, especially if you have Trackhand Trainers, Training Grounds in play rather. Then you can, and for every green mana you have, you can just put another Knuckleblade in play, and then you can use red mana to give your whole board haste. So you can kind of combo off without Soul Cauldron. If you have Training Grounds in play and a bunch of green mana, you can just go pump Knuckleblades into play over and over again, give your whole board haste and win. The other really nice thing about this card is that it also works as a win condition once you do draw your whole deck, whereas in the past I've had to run a one-of to win the game once you have drawn your whole deck. Now we can just use this to keep pumping mana into the green ability, then use the red ability to win. And the really nice thing about this combo in general is Agatha's Soul Cauldron basically means that the infinite mana is of any color, because you can use mana of any color for all your abilities, so you don't need to worry about needing a ton of green specifically for this. And then the other really nice thing about that as well is that because you're likely going to be running this as a 4-of, it means that if you have infinite mana but you don't have the Trackhand Trainer ability, you're fairly likely to have drawn this naturally, which means you can just put it into play off Redshift and just win the game without needing to draw your whole deck, which is really nice because it saves a lot of time and just improves the consistency. So this card really feels like the missing piece for that deck. And like I said, if you want to see the deck list and a bit more of a breakdown of how it works, check the premium article down in the description. But very, very excited to return to that deck. This card seems like the perfect card there. The next up we got Oasis of Renewal. So this is the other card I was talking about earlier that pairs really, really well with Insidious Roots. So just casting this as a 3-mana card basically draws you 2 cards, right? You get a land, you get a non-land, and then you can just, keep triggering it over and over again. If you exile a land from the graveyard, you get a land. If you exile a non-land, you get a non-land. So, works with the same enablers as Insidious Roots. So this kind of feels like it's just kind of a slam dunk to run alongside it. Obviously, it requires splashing a 3rd colour, but we've seen these kind of Insidious Roots decks run blue in the past for cards like Jace the Perfected Mind before that rotated. So, and I also do feel like the mana base is getting better in Alchemy. We're getting another land later in the set that I'm going to talk about that improves the mana base specifically for 3-colour decks. So, I definitely could see this seeing play in Insidious Roots if you feel the blue splash is relatively free. And it just seems like a good card to help grind into longer games as well. Now, again, my issue slightly with it is that it makes the deck even more vulnerable to graveyard hate, right? You know, it works well with your proactive game plan, but if the opponent plays something like a Rest in Peace, your whole deck just falls apart, really. So, again, it's definitely something we're going to try. I think whether this card sees play largely comes down to how free the blue splash is. You know, I've not tried a blue splash in Roots for quite a while now, so it's definitely something I'm going to try, but I wouldn't be shocked, especially with the other Root supports that we're getting in this set, for Roots to want to stick to just green-black. But either way, definitely going to be trying it out. Excited to see how it does. Outside of Alchemy, probably just not going to be good enough, but definitely excited to try it out in Alchemy. The next one we've got Dragonweave Tapestry. So if you're not familiar, I believe the spellbook is just all of the Stormbreeds from the main set. So when you cast this, you get one of each just shuffled into your deck. Which, I mean, that seems like a downside to me. Honestly, I don't think any of these cards... I mean, they're good enough to see play in Alchemy, but I don't think you'd want all of them in your deck. I don't think it's really worth building around. You know, I haven't seen a Dragon Synergy deck be good enough. Maybe with some of the support cards we're getting, it's worth more looking into, but I don't know. It doesn't really seem worth it. Now, obviously, the other downside is some of these cards might be in colors you're not running as well. Kind of offset by the ability to tap for mana of any color, and then obviously the other big upside, and the reason this costs 4 as opposed to 3 like most other rocks, is that you draw a card whenever you cast either side of the dragons here. So, you know, enables itself, good engine, can grind into longer games, but, you know, like I said, I don't think the dragons are very good in Alchemy, and I don't think a slow, you know, a 4-mana ramp card that draws you cards is really what that deck needs to be competitive either. So I would be quite surprised if this one sees play in top tier decks at least. And then finally we've got Desert Cenote. So this is the new land we're getting in the set that I was briefly talking about earlier. And this just seems like a better version of Captivating Crossroads to me. Crossroads already sees a good amount of play in 2 and 3 color decks. And the fact that you can get this, I imagine, fairly consistently in play as a dual land that also enters untapped when you're on the draw, seems very good to me. I think this is probably just going to see play over Crossroads, maybe even in addition to Crossroads in certain decks. But I think the biggest thing with this card is that it just makes 3-color decks more viable, especially 3-color decks that want to be curving out in the first few turns, because I've struggled to build consistent mana bases in 3 colors because you've either only got one fast land, which means you're then reliant on the pyres a little bit more. You know, is that what they're called? The lands that only produce the second color if you have a basic in play of either color, which is kind of awkward in Alchemy. Obviously, Fable Passage and basics still see play, but if you've only got one fast land, you then have to rely more on either the Surveil lands to enable them, which is more tap lands or not. And then even the 3-color decks that do have 2 fast lands, I feel like the next best option is still pretty awkward because you have access to the pyres, but because you're running more fast lands, you have less lands that turn on the second color for the pyre, if that makes sense. So having this alongside the fast lands probably means that you don't need to run the pyres. You can run Passage, 4 basics, you know, 8 fast lands, 4 of these. You know, you could also run Captivating Crossroads as well if you want. So yeah, I just feel like this is going to improve the mana base overall in general, but specifically for 3-color decks that want to have untapped lands in the first few turns. I think this is going to be a pretty nice upgrade there as well. So that's the whole set. You know, like I said, there's a few cards in here that I think are going to have a big impact in Historic as well, which is quite unusual for the Alchemy sets. Like Illuminating Lash, wouldn't be surprised if it sees play there. Hardened Bonds just seems absolutely nuts to me. Again, I really wouldn't be surprised if this starts seeing play in Timeless as well, because, you know, you got Bowmasters, you got Psychic Frog there that automatically trigger this. Obviously, you would need to run a few more, I think, maybe, but even outside of that, there might be some sort of combo shenanigans with this. Obviously, the once per turn is a limit on it, but, you know, it just feels like this card has so much potential, even in the more powerful formats. Loamfrill could even see play in Historic in certain decks. This pairs with Stoneforged Mystic. Swiftspear's Teaching seems insane in Historic. Probably can make it through in Timeless as well. What else have we got? And then, yeah, Xho Cai, I thought this card would be absolutely nuts in Historic, but, you know, 3 mana change is probably a good thing for there as well. But overall, that's the set. I think this set is going to be a slam dunk for Alchemy. Although, I don't know, I'm a bit concerned that a lot of the best cards here seem to slot well alongside the Is It Chorus package, like Illuminating Lash and Swiftspear's Teachings. That's a bit of a worry for the health of the format, maybe, because I still feel like the Chorus cards are pretty oppressive and can lead to some I don't know, just frustrating play patterns. But I think Alchemy is going to change a lot, and there are a few cards in here that I'm really excited for in Eternal formats as well. So, as always, it's always difficult to think of all the possibilities for these cards. So, definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any applications of these cards that I missed, because, especially with some of these unique abilities that we get on Alchemy cards, especially cards like Song of Seasons, I feel like there could be something extra there, but it's just really hard to figure out exactly what that is, if that makes sense. So let me know in the comments if you've got any ideas. Definitely let me know in the comments as well what decks you're planning to build when this set goes live tomorrow. I'm super, super excited for it. And then once it does go live, I'm going to be playtesting a bunch of decks. Like I said, I've already got theory craft lists in the works. I'll start testing them, hopefully get a few videos out on them. But yeah, either way, I'm really excited for this set to drop. Feels like one of the more powerful Alchemy sets that we've got in a while, which is kind of a dangerous thing, because we know from the past, we've seen with Revels, Trapfinder, Crucius, they do push these cards a lot, but, I love the early days when you're trying to figure out these powerful cards, especially with these Alchemy cards where it feels like it takes everyone a little bit longer to figure out the right builds for it as well. So either way, I'm super excited for this to drop tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed the set review. Let me know in the comments what you're planning to build when it does come out, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Big up.